Good afternoon and welcome to our third Law Week session for 2020. For those that joined us yesterday, welcome back. We hope to have a simpler, more straightforward session for you today. I'm Fiona Hudson and I'm the Programs Coordinator at the Goulburn Valley Libraries. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of land on which we meet today, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. We welcome you to ask any questions, and you can post them in the comments section below or email us at asklawweek@gvrlc.vic.gov.au. Today we're discussing handy tips for renters during COVID-19, and I'm now going to welcome our presenter from Victorian Legal Aid, Marcus. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you, and hi everyone, and thank you, Fiona, for your warm introduction. I think it's wonderful that we're able to enjoy these activities as part of Law Week, and I think it's wonderful that the library has set this up for our local community to have a conversation about the law, how it affects us in our everyday life. As Fiona said, today's presentation will be about handy tips for renters during COVID-19, which you'd imagine is quite a topical topic at the moment. So I hope that's helpful, I hope that's practical, and first and foremost, I hope that you enjoy it. So my name is Marcus Ibaceta and I'm a lawyer at Victorian Legal Aid in the Goulburn office. The Goulburn office is located in Shepparton, and we're responsible for making sure that Victorians in our area can get access to justice. Our services are offered to people from about Wallen in the south, all the way up north to the New South Wales border, and going east out towards the mountains. So there's a lot of people in our community, and we're mindful that this is a topic that will have a lot of relevance to many people all across our community. Before we get into the main part of our conversation today, I just want to take the time to share with you a little bit about Victorian Legal Aid and the work which we do. So Victorian Legal Aid is a government-funded agency, and it's been set up to make sure that people who cannot afford to pay for a private lawyer can get help with their legal problems. We provide free legal information for all Victorians. We run family dispute resolution for disadvantaged families, provide lawyers on duty in most courts and tribunals across the state, and we fund legal representation for people who meet our eligibility criteria. We can help people with a range of legal problems, including criminal matters, family separation, family violence, mental health, and discrimination. We also do work on renting issues with a focus mainly on evictions, and we would like to hear from you if you think that any of the things that we talk about today apply to your circumstances. So today we have a great opportunity to talk about an issue which is on the minds of at least 1 in 4 Victorians, and that being renting. One of the really great things about Law Week is that it promotes a conversation in the community about law, and it gives us a chance to really think about the role which law plays in our everyday lives, which is just what we're going to be doing today. Now, everybody needs a place to live, and I hope that by the time we finish up today, we'll each have a better understanding of how law can support us in taking control of our housing in very uncertain times. Of course, COVID-19 and its financial impacts have made renting a very current topic, both in the news and in the law. And indeed, some of the laws had just changed last week, so things are really changing quickly. In terms of how we approach the discussion today, I want to begin by sharing 2 important ideas which were in renting laws before COVID-19, and this will set up the rest of our conversation. Then move on to a very brief summary of what's new in the COVID-19 renting world. Our focus will then turn to 2 questions which many people have been asking. What options are there when you can't pay the rent? And where do evictions fall in all of this? We'll finish up with some handy tips for renters and an opportunity to discuss any questions which you may have during our conversation. Try to keep the questions general. If you have any specific questions that you'd like to ask, probably best to get in touch with a lawyer, and we'd be happy to talk about that a bit more at the end of the session today. So before we get into what coronavirus has changed, I think it would be really helpful for us to spend a few moments just thinking about what renting laws looked like before coronavirus became a part of our lives. A good starting point is for us to realise that the whole process of renting, whether it be a lease or paying rent or keeping a home in good condition, is covered by laws. In Victoria, the main set of laws which set out the rules for renting are found in the Residential Tenancies Act 1997. So what does this act tell us? I think that there are two Another example, which we'll talk about in more detail soon, is the responsibility of
Hi,
the
Marcus. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we just lost you for about 2 minutes there.
Oh dear.
So I think you were just up to, you were talking about the Residential Act.
Wonderful. So wonderful. I'll restart from there. So in Victoria, the main set of laws which set out the rules for renting are found in the Residential Tenancies Act 1997. So what does this act tell us? I think that there are two really important messages to take away from it. The first thing to take away is that tenants and landlords have rights and responsibilities. You probably know a lot of these already because you do them anyway without even thinking about the law. To give you an example, you as a tenant have a right to enjoy your home in peace and quiet, while the landlord has a responsibility to let you do this and only enter your home when they are allowed by law. Another example, which we'll talk about in more detail soon, is the responsibility of a tenant to pay rent. The second thing to remember is that tenants and landlords have to follow processes set out by law when they want to do something about the rented home or the agreement which they have made with each other. And this could be for something as small as changing a lock or as big as ending a tenancy. The reason processes have to be followed is to make sure that tenants and landlords do the right things at the right time and treat each other fairly. And one of the processes that we'll talk about today is how an eviction can happen. Before we move on to what COVID-19 has changed for renters, I just want to let you know that rights, responsibilities and processes can be different depending on the type of place you live in. The set of laws which apply to you depend on whether you live in a residential property, a rooming house, a caravan park, or specialist disability accommodation. Now, we know that coronavirus has changed many things about everyday life. There is a lot of uncertainty at the moment, and a lot of people in our community are getting through life on a really tight budget. The government has recognised that this has caused many people a lot of stress and decided that one way to relieve this pressure is to change some of the renting laws. Many of the rights and responsibilities of tenants and landlords have actually stayed the same. The main changes to the law have been to the processes which set the rules for how tenants and landlords do business with each other. At this stage, these changes to the law are temporary and they will only last until the 26th of September. And we just have to wait and see what will happen after that date. So hopefully we'll have a bit more information closer to September. Some of the biggest changes which we have seen have been about paying rent. So firstly, landlords are not allowed to increase your rent until 26th of September. It's also possible for you to speak with your landlord and agree on paying less rent, and the law sets out some new processes for this to happen. There is also a temporary pause in evictions for renters who fall behind in their rent. Now, it's really important to remember that this stop on evictions is temporary. So evictions for falling behind in rent might actually happen after the 26th of September, and landlords can still legally evict renters for other reasons. So just keep those things in mind. Other changes to know about include how you can break a lease early and also the process for how an eviction takes place. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit more about rent. Something which has not changed is that you still have a responsibility to pay rent. Because the pause in evictions for paying rent is only temporary, you may find yourself in trouble at the end of September if you have fallen behind in your payments. I recommend that you do everything you can to keep paying the right amount of rent at the right time. The good news is that there are financial supports out there which may help you be able to pay the rent. So it's a great idea, firstly, to check with Centrelink to see what types of support you may be able to access. If you're experiencing homelessness and you need funds for additional emergency accommodation, or if you need support to maintain your current private rental, you can check with one of Victoria's homelessness entry points to see if you can access some funding. In our local area, you can find these services in Broadford, Echuca, Kyabram, Seymour, Shepparton, Wangaratta and Wodonga. You may also be eligible for a rent relief grant of up to $2,000 through Housing Victoria. Whether you're eligible depends on a couple of things. So Housing Victoria will look at your household income, they'll look at your savings, what proportion of your income you spend on rent, and also whether you and your landlord have agreed to lower your rent. The important things to remember here are that you should keep paying your rent and that you may be able to get some financial support to help you do this. Keeping up with your rent now will save you some legal trouble in the future. But let's suppose that you aren't eligible for the extra payments, or perhaps you can access the payments, but you aren't able to cover all of your rent. It's really important to have a plan B. So let's now work out some strategies if you know you cannot pay all of your rent. Now, it might sound simple, but how you deal with this situation will depend on whether you want to stay at your current home or whether you would like to leave the home and start somewhere new. The choice is really up to you, but it's a good idea to know all of the choices you have so you can make a decision which works best for you. So let's think about what you should do if you cannot pay all of your rent, but you want to stay where you are. The first thing that you should do is work out how much money you can actually afford to pay. When you have worked out how much you can pay, talk with your landlord and try to have them agree to lower your rent for the time being. If your landlord offers to defer your rent instead of reducing it, be really careful before you agree to doing this. If you have your rent deferred, all that happens to your rent is that it just becomes due later, and you won't be getting any discount to make your rent more affordable. Now, this means that you could be evicted after September if you owe your landlord money which you cannot pay. It might sound like a great relief to not be paying rent for a few weeks, but the reality is that you would have to pay all of it down the track some point later. So when you reach an agreement with your landlord, make sure that you put your agreement in writing. At a minimum, I recommend that you should have at least your date of the agreement. It should say how much the rent will cost, when it has to be paid, and for how long this new setup will last. What you should then do is contact Consumer Affairs Victoria and ask them to register your agreement. And if you're interested in accessing the $2,000 rent relief grant that's offered by Housing Victoria, you're actually required to register your agreement first. So it's a really good idea. Once you agree with your landlord, get in touch with Consumer Affairs, then you might be eligible for some additional support down the track. Now, That's great if you can agree with your landlord. I think that would be an excellent solution for the time being. But you'd want to know what happens if you can't agree. So if you can't agree with the landlord, my first step would be to contact Consumer Affairs, and I would let them know that I've tried to negotiate the rent, but just can't reach an agreement with the landlord. And what Consumer Affairs will do from there is work out if they can assist, and they'll work out whether dispute resolution will be appropriate. Now, if this happens, your case may go to the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria for a free mediation. And the idea with mediation is that an independent person, so somebody who doesn't have anything to do with you or your landlord, will help guide a conversation between you and your landlord to help you come up with an agreement on how the rent should be paid. It's also possible for VCAT, which is a tribunal which makes decisions about renters and landlords, for VCAT to make an order which reduces the rent or sets up a payment plan. But really, you should only go to VCAT after speaking with Consumer Affairs and getting legal advice about your circumstances as well. So you need to do those two things before you make your way to VCAT for an order. Now, if you're staying at your rented property and if you know that staying is going to cause you severe hardship, another option which you have is to actually end your tenancy or to break the lease. Now, do you remember what I said earlier about tenants and landlords having to follow the law when they want to change their rental agreement? Well, the steps you need to take here depend on the type of lease you have. So you might have a fixed term lease, which is when you and your landlord agree that you'll rent a home for a set period, usually 6 months or a year. Or you could have another type of lease called a periodic lease, which is a month-to-month agreement. So let's first think about the fixed term lease. So if you have a fixed term lease, there are usually penalties if you break a lease early. But if you can show that you will suffer severe hardship if the lease goes on, you can actually end the lease without penalty. And you can do this in two ways. The first way is to give your landlord a 14-day notice of intention to vacate, or you can apply to VCAT to reduce the term of the lease. Now, these options work only if you can show that continuing the lease will cause you severe hardship. Otherwise, you may have to pay a penalty. So finding that hardship and being able to show it is really important if you want to break the lease early. Now, renters who are on a periodic lease also have the option of giving a landlord 14 days notice if they feel that staying will cause them severe hardship. But renters who are on a periodic lease who want to leave for any reason or no particular reason can still leave with 28 days notice, which is exactly what you could do before the Covid-19 changes. So there's two different types of leases there. If you're on the, and for both kinds of leases, you can leave with 14 days notice if there's severe hardship. But if you're on a periodic lease, the COVID changes haven't affected your normal right to leave with 28 days notice, but that 28 days only applies if you're on a periodic lease. So just to sum up the main points for ending your tenancy early, it's crucial that you can show evidence of severe hardship. Otherwise, you may not be entitled to end the lease and you may have to pay a penalty if you end it early. Now, a really practical way to do this is to think about your income, think about your expenses, and work out what effect staying would have on your livelihood and would your quality of life decrease if you had to keep up with a lease that you couldn't afford. And then when you've worked that out, compare that to how your co-tenants or your landlord may suffer if you decide to break the lease early. Now, in any event, deciding to end the lease early is a pretty big step. And I think it would be really wise to discuss your situation and options with a lawyer before you go ahead and break a lease. Now, the last thing I want to talk with you about is whether you can be evicted while the temporary rental laws are in place. And the short answer to that is yes. So for a renter to be evicted, a landlord will need to apply for and get 2 orders from VCAT. Think of this as a 2-stage process. The first stage involves VCAT making a termination order. A termination order will say that you have to leave your property by a certain day. A landlord has to supply a reason allowed by law if they would like a termination order to be made. Now, many of these reasons are the same as before COVID-19 happened. Some of these reasons relate to tenant fault, things like using your house for an illegal purpose or causing serious damage to your property. But there are other reasons that you can be evicted which involve no fault of the tenant as well. But this hasn't really changed from before COVID became a reality of our lives. The second stage in the eviction process involves VCAT making a possession order, which would happen if you haven't left the property by the date in the termination order. Now, a possession order makes it possible for a landlord to purchase a warrant of possession and have the police evict you. Before making either of these orders, VCAT needs to consider whether the order is reasonable and proportionate in all the circumstances. So it has to think about what's going on in your life as well. Now, what happens with evictions if you cannot pay your rent? It really depends on whether you can afford to pay rent. Normally, non-payment of rent would give a landlord a reason to evict you. And as we've talked about today, your responsibilities as a tenant really have not changed during this COVID period. So the expectation is that you will still pay rent as it becomes due. The message is simple. If you can afford to pay rent, but you decide not to pay it, you can be evicted, and this can happen before September. But for those of you who genuinely cannot keep up with the payments, you can be confident that you won't be evicted for this reason, at least until the temporary measures expire in September. But remember that severe hardship is the key. Now, if you find yourself in that position where you really can't pay the rent, do your very best to negotiate a reduced rent with your landlord and do what you can to access the financial supports which are available, because meeting your payments now, even if it's really hard to do them, will save you a bit of stress, uncertainty, and debt in the future. So I think this is a good place for us to stop today and reflect on the main ideas we've thought about and turn these ideas into practical steps which we can use as renters every day. And while today has focused on the new laws in the time of COVID-19, I think that these steps are worth thinking about even when things return to normal. So here are 5 handy tips for renters to take away from today. The first tip is to remember your responsibilities as a renter. I know that many of you have already been doing this for a very long time, but I guess the main point I want to make here is that your responsibilities haven't really changed because of COVID-19. At the moment, the law has a little bit of understanding if you cannot pay all of the rent you thought you could when you started your lease, but you're still expected to pay an agreed amount of rent. Which brings us to our second tip, which is to be realistic with what you can afford. We're really lucky that we're actually allowed to negotiate a new price for the rent that we pay. And the opportunity is there to actually help you adjust your rent to an amount which you can commit to while times are tough. It may be really tempting to offer a higher amount than you can afford because you don't want to look bad in front of your landlord. But the reality is that if you can't meet the payments, you'll have a debt which could lead to an eviction later on. So it's really better to stick with what you can afford. The third idea, to work out and to put forward your interests, requires you to think really carefully about your living situation, your plans for the future, your values, and how they all relate to your rental agreement. It's important to remember that any new agreement with your landlord is an agreement, and your landlord doesn't have to get everything that they want, okay? You have a say in this too. Know exactly what you won't negotiate on, know what you're flexible about, and you can feel confident in putting forward your position to work out something that everybody can agree to. The next tip is very much at the heart of today's conversation. As renters, we have a couple of ways that we can act when we just can't afford the rent. But ultimately, how you act, how you choose to do this is your choice. Now, whether you stay or whether you leave a rental property is a decision that will depend on your personal circumstances and also how comfortable you feel with the legal risks and benefits which can follow. Whether you decide to stay or go, make sure that you follow the correct legal processes to make your choice count and avoid trouble in the future. The final tip may very well be the next step for you after our conversation today. Speaking with a lawyer to get legal advice is a really important step which helps you understand exactly how the law applies to your personal circumstances. As lawyers, we take the time to listen to you and advise you on your situation so you can make an informed decision. No issue for us is too big or too small. Most of our renting work at Victorian Legal Aid is focused on evictions, but we can give you advice on other renting issues as well. So if you're thinking that you would like to speak with a lawyer about renting, right now is the time to pick up the phone and give us a call. And you can do that on our legal help helpline, which is 1300 792 387. And if you'd like to get in touch with our Shepparton office, you can reach us on our office number, which is 5823 6200. So I hope that everyone here today found something useful which you can take away and use in your everyday life. And now that you have some handy tips, why not have a chat with your neighbours and friends to teach them something about renting during COVID-19? Now, I see that we've actually got some questions that have been coming throughout our conversation. So I think now's a good time to take a look at some of those and keep the conversation rolling.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, we've had a couple of questions come in actually, and I believe another one coming in possibly as we speak. So the first one we had was someone who is in financial hardship and has been impacted by COVID. They have done an agreement to reduce their rent with their landlord, and it'll be reviewed in August. And their question is, will they be evicted after September?
Okay, so I think the first thing to remember is that if they are experiencing hardship, that they won't be evicted until at least September. Whether they're evicted after September depends on two things. If they're able to meet their payments on the revised arrangement, then there won't be any money owing, and therefore there wouldn't be an eviction for any rental arrears. If there is money owing, with the way that the law is at the moment, we can assume that there will be an eviction, but there's also a lot of unknowns at the moment, and we really don't know what's going to be happening after September and how the temporary measures will be integrated into our post-COVID world. So in answer to whether someone who's fallen behind will be evicted, we really just have to wait and see. But the current way that the law is, we would think that if people haven't been able to meet their payments, that an eviction after September is quite possible.
Okay. I guess the next part of that is then, should they lodge a request for mediation?
Absolutely, I think that's a really good idea. Probably best to do it through the Consumer Affairs Victoria channel. I say that because that would also give the opportunity to register any rental agreement that has been made, but also to register any attempts which you've made at a rental agreement which have failed. So that way it goes on a public record. But mediation would always be a great idea to see if you can reduce the rent, make it more affordable.
Right, okay. Next question is the rent reduction that has been agreed to sufficient for a land tax reduction?
Not entirely sure to the answer of that question. Usually renters wouldn't be paying land tax, so it's quite possible that maybe this question is maybe for someone who's renting who also owns their own rental property. I'll just say now that Victoria Legal Aid doesn't do any work on taxation. So those particular matters, probably better to go see a lawyer that specialises in taxation.
Fair enough. And the last question is the rent reduction that has been agreed to sufficient for an application for a rent relief grant offered by the Victorian government?
So that really depends. So there's a couple of things that you need to do, and I think ultimately check with Housing Victoria. So the things that you need to be eligible for a rent relief grant, you need to have savings of less than $5,000. You need to have you need to have registered a reduced rental agreement with Consumer Affairs. You need to be paying at least 30% of your overall household income, and that needs to be going towards rent. And also your combined household income, it's subject to a cap. It's around about $1,900 a week, but it's best to check that with Consumer Affairs and also Housing Victoria.
Okay. Now, we've just had another question come in on Facebook, which is, what do you see happening after September regarding renting?
You know, I really wish that I knew the answer to that. It's one of those crystal ball questions, you know. I think that what will be a big reality is that many people would still be trying to recover, like on an economic perspective, and there'll probably be a lot of debt still at that point in time. In terms of what I would say as a lawyer, we only know what's happening up to the 26th of September, and what we know is happening after that is we're going back to the old rules after the 26th of September, which would mean that people could be evicted for rent arrears. But it's a really dynamic situation. We had a set of laws that had changed just last week about renting. So I'd expect there to be some movement, but it's definitely worth keeping track of to see what will happen after September.
So where would people go to get, so the information you've offered today, which has been awesome, and I believe that, you know, you've offered a lot of tangible actions and information. So as you're saying, the laws are changing quite regularly, and this is one area that I guess people are impacted quite quickly. Where would they go to find more information, just generally, like as things change? You know, if we're not doing a Law Week presentation for renters every week, then where would they go?
So there's plenty of places, I think, which offer good information, and it's usually quite up to date. So at Victoria Legal Aid, we have a website that's available for the public, and we've actually put out a whole lot of coronavirus resources on renting, which actually went live today. So if you look up Victoria Legal Aid on the internet, and you'll find our page, and we'll have a section there on legal information, and we have plenty of information there. Other places that you can check out places like Housing Victoria and Consumer Affairs. You can also try your local community legal centre. Victoria is really lucky as well to have its own specialist community legal centre for housing. So Tenants Victoria will be able to give plenty of information. So there's lots of information that's out there. It's available online. We also offer printed resources as well. So if you don't have access to the internet, but if you have access to a telephone line, you can give us a call and request publications, and we'd be more than happy to assist you with that.
Great. Well, what we might get is some of those organisations that can help. We'll get those details and we'll put them in the comment section below. And of course, once the libraries reopen, we're happy to provide, you know, forward names and addresses of contacts as well. So that's fine as well. Well, I think that's it for us. So as far as the questions go, I believe that we've answered all of them. So I just want to say thank you, Marcus, for joining us today. We really appreciate your support in helping our community learn about, you know, situations that at the moment are ever changing and changing rapidly. And I hope this has been a great forum for people to check that out. So thank you very much today for your presentation. We appreciate it, and I think you've provided a lot of information and a lot of actions for people to do in the near future if they have any problems.
Thanks so much for that, Fiona. I really enjoyed being here, and I hope that there's something that that everybody who attended today could take away and find useful.
Definitely. So thank you to everyone else watching out there. We appreciate you joining us. And tomorrow we'll be back at 3 p.m. with a slightly different session, which is Coffee with a Cop, which you can definitely post your questions on the Facebook Live. And Glenn will be joining us, and he'll be talking through all things to do with policing in our Golden Valley. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again tomorrow.